All right, so we begin my top 24 remaining quarterback rankings. These are quarterback rankings for Sunday and Monday. Thursday and Friday games have already happened. So if you see some quarterbacks missing from these rankings and they've already played on Thursday and Friday, that's why. With quarterbacks that I think are probably back-end QB2s, we have Bryce Young, Aaron Rodgers, and Kirk Cousins. So Bryce Young is coming off his best fantasy performance of the year. He had 16 points this past week. He scored double digits in 3 of the past 4. It is an advantageous matchup against Tampa Bay, but I do want to see more consistency from Bryce Young before I can truly trust to project him to be a little bit higher in these rankings. Aaron Rodgers is coming off a 16 point fantasy performance as well, but he had single digit fantasy points in the week prior to that. Seattle is a bit of a trap game potentially for him. Their defense isn't as bad as you might think. And so I do think that he's a back end QB2. He doesn't provide any rushing upside at all. And with the season kind of spiraling for the Jets, I'm not really sure what his commitment to the team is going to look like. But I still think that he's a back end QB2. I just think that there are a lot better options for us this week. Kirk Cousins is coming off a bye week, so they've had a little bit extra time to prepare for this matchup against the Chargers. While the Chargers defense was quite stingy against quarterback production earlier on in the year, they kind of slacked recently. Now, Kirk Cousins before the bye did have a single-digit game in terms of his fantasy points, but before that he had been on a decent roll by his standards. In general, if he plays Tampa Bay, he's a great start, but the Chargers have been slacking recently, and so I do think that he's a decent back-end QB2 this week, but a quite risky play. Now we have quarterbacks that I still think are QB2s, but I do think have more upside than the previously mentioned quarterbacks. We have Winston, May, and Carr. So Jameis, in his 4 starts this season, has scored double-digit fantasy points in each of them. He's had 2 20-point games. Now, this isn't a good matchup, but it's better, in my opinion, than what he had the week prior, where they were in a blizzard against Pittsburgh. That's about as tough as it gets. Denver's defense is absolutely no joke either, though. And so I do think that he's probably going to turn the ball over a couple times in this game, but the passing volume should be there for him. And so I think he's a better start than some of these other guys, but still a risky one. Now we have Drake May against the Indianapolis Colts. So he's thrown an interception in each week since week 9, but he's also had at least 24 rushing yards in each game since week 7. And so I do think he's going to give us a mixture of positivity in regards to the rushing upside, but I do think he's going to have a couple turnovers in this game, making him a risky QB2, but he definitely has a bunch of upside. Now we have Derek Carr against the Rams. So he's thrown a passing touchdown in each of the past 3 weeks. The Rams should necessitate him throwing the ball quite a bit, but they're not a joke of a matchup either. I don't know how the offensive line is going to fare against Jared Verse either. I do think he's going to get quite a few pressures in this game. And so I do think that he's going to have the passing volume necessary, but I do think that this is a pretty tough test for him. Now we have quarterbacks that I think are probably mid to high-end QB2s that I feel a little bit better about than some of the previously mentioned quarterbacks. We have Will Levis, Geno Smith, T-Law if he plays, Anthony Richardson, Matt Stafford, and CJ Stroud. So Will Levis has been a pleasant surprise, having at least 15 fantasy points in each of the past 3 weeks. I do think that continues against Washington. They don't have the worst defense in the world, but they're definitely exploitable. And he has been, besides taking a lot of sacks, basically in every other aspect of being a quarterback, he has been tremendous the past 3 weeks. Now we have Geno Smith against the Jets. While it theoretically is a tough matchup on paper, they've been slacking recently, but he's been in a slump the past couple of weeks. And so until we see him get out of that slump, I'm going to rank him a little bit lower. Now we have Trevor Lawrence against Houston. It's a really good matchup for him. He threw 2 touchdowns in the prior matchup between the 2 teams. This is under the assumption that he plays. He's gotten in some limited practices, and Coach Peterson, for whatever his word is worth, has said that it looks like he'll play. So just going by that, we'll see. But I do think he should get a good amount of passing volume in this game. And I think people really have this idea that he's a terrible quarterback. I think he's an above average quarterback, but not elite or anything. It's just that his offensive line and play calling are terrible. But I do think this is a matchup that he can take advantage of. Anthony Richardson is playing against New England this week. This is definitely a matchup that he can exploit, especially on the ground. He's had at least 30 rushing yards in each of the past 2 weeks, and he had 2 rushing touchdowns 2 weeks ago. I don't think he's going to have a prolific day through the air, but I do think he gets a rushing touchdown on the ground and over 50 rushing yards. Matt Stafford is coming off a QB 8-5 finish in each of the past 2 weeks, but New Orleans defense, despite getting rid of Marshawn Lattimore, is still a really tough test for him. I do think he has a couple turnovers in this game, but I think he's going to kind of offset that with a couple passing touchdowns. And so I do think he's a high-end QB2 this week, but I do think he's going to have a couple turnovers, preventing him from being a QB1. Now we have CJ Stroud against Jacksonville. This is the best matchup that you could possibly ask for quarterbacks. And so I do think he's going to have a better day than we've seen throughout most of the season. Uh, while he has regressed slightly, I think some of it's due to play calling, and it's especially due to the offensive line and Nico Collins being hurt throughout portions of the season. I do think, though, that this is once again a matchup that he can exploit. I think he's going to see quite a bit of passing volume, and I do think he's going to finish as a high-end QB2 this week. If you like what you've seen and heard so far, feel free to like and subscribe. Remember that players who played on Thursday night or Friday night are not included in these rankings, so if you notice somebody missing and they fit under that criteria, that's why. And make sure you check out my running back, wide receiver, and tight end rankings as they come out. I'm releasing tight end and quarterback rankings on Friday night, and then on Saturday, I'm releasing running back and wide receiver rankings. Thanks. Now we have quarterbacks that I think are going to finish as mid to low-end QB1s, but I don't think are likely candidates to be the QB1 this week. We have Brock Purdy, Sam Darnold, Kyler Murray, Bo Nix, Russ Wilson, and Justin Herbert. So Brock Purdy has been a top 12 quarterback in all but 4 weeks so far, excluding his bye week, obviously. Now, he is expected to play according to reports, at least at the point of me recording this video, but Buffalo's defense is very stingy. If he had an easier matchup, I would project him quite a bit higher, but I still think that they're probably going to have to pass the ball quite a bit to stay in this game with Buffalo. And so while it is a tough matchup, I think due to sheer passing volume alone that he's a pretty solid option as a low-end QB1. Sam Darnold has been the QB6 and QB9 in each of the past 2 weeks, so I think he's going to continue that relative level of success. Arizona is a tough matchup for him, but he's been playing turnover-free football, at least in the form of interceptions in each of the past 2 weeks, and so I think that continues, and I think that he's going to throw a couple touchdowns in this game. Kyler Murray is playing against Minnesota this week. While it is, in general, a tough matchup due to their defense giving odd fronts and you have to guess where the pressure is coming from, Caleb Williams was able to expose them, and so I think that Kyler Murray's definitely capable of that. I think Trey McBride's going to have a pretty good day. I think Marvin Harrison Jr. is going to have quite a bit of success this week, and so I think Kyler Murray is going to be able to exploit them through the air and the ground. Bo Nix is coming off a QB7 finish and a QB finish the week before that. I think he's going to continue to be a top 12 option for us. The matchup against Cleveland is a little bit tricky. I do think Myles Garrett's going to give them some problems, but his offensive line has been one of the best in the entire NFL in terms of pass protection. And so I do think that bodes well for him. I think that due to sheer volume alone, he's going to be a top 10 option. And what a steal. If you believed in him, then props to you. You got yourself a winner. Russell Wilson has been a bit of a mixed bag in Pittsburgh since he started for them. I do think, though, against Cincinnati, he's going to have to throw the ball quite a bit. I do think that Joe Burrow is going to be able to overcome the defense of Pittsburgh, at least relatively compared to how most quarterbacks fare against them. And so I think that's going to be good for Russ Wilson. And I think George Pickens has a pretty good day. Justin Herbert has been a top 12 quarterback in each week since week 7. I think that continues. He's playing against Atlanta this week. Their defense is absolutely exploitable. The game script should require quite a bit of passing on his part, and so I do think he and Ladd McConkey have a pretty solid day for us in fantasy. And now we have quarterbacks that I think are mid to elite QB1s and are more likely candidates than some of the other quarterbacks that I've mentioned to be the QB1 overall this week. We have Joe Burrow, Lamar Jackson, Josh Allen, Baker Mayfield, Jaden Daniels, and Jalen Hurts. So Joe Burrow has been a top 1 or 2 quarterback in each of the past 3 weeks. He has on an absolute tear recently. Pittsburgh is the ultimate test. I do think he's going to be able to overcome them due to sheer passing volume. I do think he turns the ball over in this game, but I think that Jamar Chase and T. Higgins are going to be way too much for Pittsburgh to contend with this week. So Lamar Jackson has been a top 12 quarterback in every week this year but 1. And so even though it is a matchup against Philly, it's really tough to project him to be anything less than a QB1, even in a tough matchup. The game script should probably necessitate an uptick in passing, even though it is a tough matchup. And so I do think he's going to be able to hit Mark Andrews and Zay Flowers through the air, but I don't think he's going to have one of these massive QB1 weeks. Josh Allen has been a top 12 quarterback in every week since week 8. I think that continues here, even against San Fran. Their defense is pretty stingy, but it's Josh Allen. I do think he has a rushing touchdown, which helps boon his fantasy day. and I do think he's going to be quite efficient even in a tough matchup. Now we have Baker Mayfield against the Carolina Panthers. I think he's going to absolutely shred them. He could have had a fantastic fantasy day if they didn't run the ball right at the goal line this past week. He did hit the Tommy Cutlets celebration this past week. I think he's probably not going to do that celebration again, but I do think he's going to be scoring quite a few touchdowns, and I'm projecting 3 for him in this game. Jaden Daniels was in a bit of a slump, but he had 30 fantasy points this past week, at least in a 4 points per touchdown format. Tennessee's defense, while it was really stingy at the beginning of the season, L'Jarius Sneed's on IR. The defense is regressing quite a bit. I don't think they're going to be able to do really much of anything to stop him, and I do think he's going to have over 50 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown this week. Jalen Hurts is in a bit of a rough stretch the past 2 weeks, but boy, if there was ever a get-right matchup, it's against Baltimore. I do think he's going to have a prolific day through the air and on the ground. I do think he has a rushing touchdown, and I think he is the QB1 this week. All right, and so to conclude, quarterbacks that I think are back-end QB2s this week, we have Bryce Young, Aaron Rodgers, and Kirk Chainz. Quarterbacks that I still think are QB2s, but I think have more upside than the previously mentioned quarterbacks are Winston, May, and Carr. Quarterbacks I think are mid to high-end QB2s this week, we have Levis, Smith, T-Law, A-Rich, Stafford, and Stroud. Quarterbacks that I think are mid to low-end QB1s this week, and probably not likely candidates to be the QB1. We have Brock Purdy, Sam Darnold, Kyler Murray, Bo Nix, Russ Wilson, and Justin Herbert. And then quarterbacks that I think are mid to elite QB1s with a realistic shot at being the QB1 this week. We have Joe Burrow, Lamar Jackson, Josh Allen, Baker Mayfield, Jaden Daniels, and Jalen Hurts. All right, you know the drill. Who do I have too high? Who do I have too low? Remember that quarterbacks who played on Thursday or Friday are not included in these rankings. So if you notice somebody missing and they fit under that criteria, that's why they're not included in this list. Also, make sure to check out my tight end, running back, and wide receiver rankings as they come out. And make sure to give me a follow on X. I'm going to leave that link in the description. Thanks.